Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for our author event with Professor Elyse Graham. As part of the library's World War II month, she is joining us tonight for a conversation about her newest release, Book and Dagger, How Scholars and Librarians Became the Unlikely Spies of World War II. During the month of March, our adult services team here at the Hudson Library has been featuring World War II month, and we have already had many events, but we still have a few coming up if you haven't yet joined us. Both of these upcoming events are virtual. This coming Saturday on the 22nd, we have New York Times bestselling author Caroline Moorhead. She's joining us for a talk on her new book, A House in the Mountains, The Women Who Liberated Italy from Fascism. And on Tuesday, March 25th, the Cleveland Museum of Art will be doing a presentation on the Monuments Men, the Cleveland Connection. So both of those are virtual. You can enjoy from your home. They're not here in the library. We still have seats available. If you would like to register, you can just visit the library's website at hudsonlibrary.org. Allow me to introduce our author this evening. Elyse Graham is a historian and professor at Stony Brook University in New York. She holds degrees from Princeton, Yale, and MIT, and is the author of 3 academic books: You Talkin' to Me, The Unruly History of New York English, A Unified Theory of Cats on the Internet, which that one has sparked my intention. I would love to read that one next. And The Republic of Games, Textual Culture Between Old Books and New Media. And if you haven't yet purchased your copy of Book and Dagger, The Learned Owl is set up in the back. You can get your copy tonight, and our author will be signing books at the end of our program tonight. So please join me in welcoming Professor Elyse Graham.
Hello. Oh, wait. How do I? I've got it. Hello. Today I'm here to talk to you about World War II and the true story of how librarians saved the world and invented modern spycraft. The amazing thing about this story is that it really did happen. The OSS, the predecessor to today's Central Intelligence Agency, really did recruit the nation's most bookish types to become secret agents in dangerous undercover missions abroad. These were missions that required their knowledge and love of books, just as a fighter pilot's mission requires a knowledge of planes. The book that I wrote on the subject follows a small, interconnected group of people, but the OSS recruited hundreds of them: mild-mannered professors and oddball archivists and restless librarians. Because America had no standing intelligence agency at the start of the war and needed to build up an instant bank of expertise on every subject in the library, the OSS simply raided the library for recruits. These bookish types were pulled into the Cloak and Dagger Brigade and trained, in the words of one contemporary, in all the black arts of mystery, deception, and mayhem. Their adventures took them and the saboteurs, swindlers, and human smugglers they found themselves suddenly collaborating with to the covered bazaars of Istanbul, a secretive legation in Stockholm, a salt mine near Austria, a seedy cafe in Marseille, an impossibly posh spy training camp near London, a deception training camp outside of Los Angeles that might as well have been a studio lot, a power plant hidden in the snowy mountains of Norway that the Nazis were using in a scheme to develop a secret weapon. But above all, their adventures took them through the world of books. Because I knew there would be book lovers here today, I actually brought books to pass around. These books are from the period of World War II, and they're all meaningful to World War II, especially the period spycraft, because of some aspect of their bookishness. The first example that I'll give is this book, My 3 Years with Eisenhower. I need somebody here to take this book. Thank you. You can pass it around, put your hands on it, look through it. Don't worry about damaging it. By Harry Butcher. This was published in 1946, just after the end of the war. At the time, a lot of aspects of the war were still classified, including the code names of big military operations. So, Operation Fortitude, for instance, a deception operation that disguised the preparations for the D-Day landings by making it look like the Allies wanted to land in Norway, not France. That code name was still classified. Nobody was supposed to know what it was. Nobody was supposed to know about the Fortitude operation either. Some of these secrets remained classified for decades. Now, the first lesson about spycraft that I want to teach you is secrets aren't secure. If you have assets or information that you want to hide from others, you should try as much as possible to keep whatever system you use to hide those assets from depending on secrets like code names or passwords, because people are terrible at keeping secrets, which is demonstrated by this book. It was written by a former aide of General Dwight Eisenhower who knew all about fortitude. And before it was published, US intelligence went through it and cut out every reference to fortitude. But they forgot to check the book's index. So you see, there it is. The secret got out. Books can reveal all kinds of things if you just know how to use them. Let's go back to the beginning. One day in early 1942, government agents marched into the New York Public Library and demanded to see the collections of maps. The same scene was playing out at libraries all over the country. A librarian at UCLA later recalled hearing stories from his elders of coming to work and finding that the map library had suddenly become a top security area protected by 24-hour armed guards. These agents were probably members of Research and Analysis, which was the intelligence analysis division of the OSS, the predecessor to today's Central Intelligence Agency. At the time, R&A agents were hunting through libraries and confiscating all kinds of books, travel books, phone books, scientific books, industry directories, sometimes even novels. But maps provide an especially potent example as to why. In 1941, when the United States entered the war, the US had just 2 sets of maps showing all of Japan. You need maps in order to fight a war. If you have soldiers landing on the shore of some town in North Africa, you need to know what the roads are into and out of town, where you might be ambushed by retreating Axis troops, what buildings you need to prioritize capturing, like the hospital and the telegraph office. You cannot strategize without maps. You can't put boots on the ground unless you first put ground under the boots. And in the area of maps, as in many other areas, US libraries were utterly deficient. They had been taking for granted that if professors, let's say, really wanted to look at a source, they could go to Europe. But after the war started, of course, that wasn't possible. The military was deficient too. The Army Corps of Engineers, which had been making most of the maps the military used, had a budget before the war that provided for 2 cartographers. Because of this, during the war, making maps was a huge component of the work of R&A geographers, who passed endless hours copying historical maps in the New York Public Library. They drew situation maps every day for the War Department. They drew reference maps and thematic maps to accompany the reports that R&A wrote at the request of military and government officials. They drew maps to propose strategic elements of upcoming military operations. And they used, in ingenious ways, whatever maps they could get their hands on. Maps that were never meant to be used in war. This map, for instance, which is a whaling map that the Wilkes expedition published in the 19th century. It's a copper plate engraving. The surveyors got their measurements by firing guns from ships and listening for the echo. Herman Melville used it while writing Moby Dick. This is not ideal lumber for the age of radar, but this is what they had to work with. And remarkably, they made it work. So, lesson 2 of spycraft. It's a lesson that professors know all too well. The answers might be right in front of you, but you won't see them unless you do the reading. Nothing in the library is unimportant. I'm now passing around some more books from the period. I normally have, but couldn't bring on the airplane, like a gigantic atlas from the 1920s, like the size of a table. And then I would say, like, you know, R&A agents worked in the New York Public Library, but they also worked in Rockefeller Center, which was the secret OSS headquarters in New York City. So they used very young couriers, because you never suspect a child. So I would ask people to imagine like a boy running up 6th Avenue from the New York Public Library to Rockefeller Center carrying this atlas that's the size of a table. But here are some others. This is Sweden on $50, a guidebook for tourists. You'll note that it contains a map, guidebooks often did, and this is a tourist's guide to Istanbul, which again contains maps. And books like these had other very valuable information, like where the railway station was, where are the train tracks that you might need to sabotage during a battle to keep Axis reinforcements from arriving. Here is another book, just a street directory for Casablanca that contains, if you just look, street addresses for every Casablanca business that you need to sabotage or occupy. Matériel de chemin de fer, that's railway equipment. Société Française de Munitions de Chasse, de Tir et de Guerre, that's French for munitions factory. All the post, telegraph, and telephone offices that could give up the whole goose, the electric works, the Red Cross Pharmacy, a full map of every borough, port, and railroad that runs from Morocco to France. Everything you need, hidden in plain sight at the New York Public Library. Now, the OSS also sent professors and librarians abroad on secret undercover missions. In the book, I focus on a small but connected group of these library rats turned unlikely spies. They include Joseph Curtis, a literature professor who hunted down German spies and turned them into double agents, and Adele Kuyber, an archivist who was sent to Stockholm to secretly acquire documents for the OSS. Although he stayed in Washington, I also want to mention Sherman Kent, a smart-mouthed history professor who rose to become the head of intelligence analysis for all of Europe and Africa. We'll come back to him later. Let's suppose that it's 1942, and you've been pulled out of your library to become a spy. And it did happen like that. You'd get a call at the library, or a government agent would show up at the door to your classroom while you were teaching, or someone would come to recruit you during a school football game when nobody would notice another alumni-looking dude walking around campus in a suit. How do they teach you, who have no actual fighting experience, to be a spy? First, they'd send you to training camp. So, Joseph Curtis, literature professor at Yale. One day in August 1942, the head of his department paid him a visit in his faculty apartment at a residential college. The guy said, "Listen, you have to go to the Yale Club in New York City tomorrow. You have to wear a purple tie. You're going to see a man light a cigarette and then put it out. Talk to that man. He has a message for you." As ridiculous as it sounds, as much like a spy story as it sounds, that's how he got recruited. As it turns out, because the people recruiting and training these spies were often new to spycraft themselves, they got a lot of their ideas from spy fiction. Recruitment felt straight out of a spy novel because that's where they got their playbook. As the book historian Robert Darnton says, literature doesn't just reflect history. Literature creates history. So, you'd recognize your mysterious contact because he was wearing a red carnation, or because he was holding a Penguin paperback with its distinctive orange cover, like this one. Or he might be holding a newspaper. I just have this kind of reproduction of a newspaper here. And how he'd be holding the newspaper was a signal. If the newspaper was sticking out of his overcoat pocket, it was safe to meet. If the newspaper was folded under his arm, he was being followed, and you should pretend not to know him. After you joined the OSS, you'd be sent to a spy training camp. The English had spy training schools that were incredibly posh. They were in country manners and had housemasters and servants and such. The Americans had camps with tents in national parks, which had terrain that could support combat exercises as well as enough seclusion to keep the goings-on secret. A totally different experience. But the English sent over their fighting instructors to teach the American spies how to fight. So you, as a professor, as a librarian, would be learning how to do the kind of close combat that leaves the other person not injured, but dead. I'm passing around one of the fighting manuals that those instructors wrote. I wish to note that these manuals assume that in the field you will not have a weapon on you. If you're a spy, you can have either a cover story or a weapon, but you can't have both. If the Gestapo arrests you and you're carrying a lipstick that turns into a gun or a shoe that turns into a radio transmitter, you can't really pretend that you're an ordinary civilian. So you were taught how to use ordinary objects as weapons, how to kill someone with a newspaper, how to restrain someone with their own trousers. You also learned how to take weapons from other people, but the assumption was that you'd be out in the field with only your wits to protect you. This wasn't like James Bond with all his cool gadgets. After his training, Joseph Curtis went to Istanbul. Adele Kuyber went to Stockholm. Her job was to acquire documents that the Allies could use to develop intelligence and plan covert operations. Because a war was happening, you could no longer get things like newspapers or books or scientific journals from Germany or other Axis countries, not if you were in the United States. And as ingenious as the library rats were who were working with existing materials in the New York Public Library and elsewhere, there was still a pressing need to supplement their work by secretly acquiring documents abroad. Sweden was a neutral country, but it was filled with German documents. The Germans very badly wanted Swedes to believe that Americans were ruffians who had no concept of culture, that if they won, they would tear down the libraries and concert halls of Europe. And so, the Germans sent to Stockholm, as proof of their own Kultur with a K, professors to give lectures wearing little round glasses, conductors to wave batons over performances of the magic flute. They made sure their scientific and technical journals flowed without wartime interruption into Stockholm's libraries and universities so that Swedish intellectuals would understand that scientific progress spoke the German language. This was a gap in the German defenses that Kuyber could take advantage of. Even though Sweden was a neutral country, Khyber had to work undercover. Sweden had made a deal with the warring countries that it could maintain its neutrality as long as no spies operated in Sweden. Moreover, Sweden's sentiments tilted toward the Axis. The Swedish police were aligned with the Gestapo and had even trained with the Gestapo. If a spy was caught by the Swedish police, they faced arrest, imprisonment, deportation, even Gestapo-style beatings and interrogations. Stockholm was neutral, but it wasn't impartial, and it was far from a safe place to be a spy. But Khyber had, without knowing it, been training her whole life for exactly this mission. Khyber had a PhD in classics from the University of Chicago, and because women couldn't really go into the professoriate in those years, she became a professional archive hunter, hopping from archive to archive across Europe, earning money by taking photographs of rare texts for scholars back home in the States, who did not have, in those days before the internet, any other way of seeing such texts besides visiting the archives themselves. By the time she was recruited by the OSS, she had been doing this for almost a decade. Khyber's cover in Stockholm was that she was looking for books to add to the collections of the Library of Congress. Normal books, nothing to do with intelligence. Another rule of spycraft. A spy has to perform their cover as competently as the spycraft, which means if someone is pretending to work for a library, it's best that they have experience working with libraries. She acquired and secretly sent home on microfilm all kinds of documents that she should not have gotten access to. Industry directories, trade magazines, railway schedules, German newspapers, atlases, maps, technical journals, German newsletters that were on a restricted list and only went to certain vetted subscribers, underground resistance literature, privately printed books, books that had been printed by underground presses, and books that the German government had designated secret books and pulled from circulation, current newspapers as well as back copies dating to 1940, publications on aeronautics, banking, bibliography, electronics, governance, finance, international relations, labor, law, legislation, metallurgy, mining, politics, regulations, shipbuilding, statistics, synthetic petroleum, and scientific publications of every description. Here is one of those industry directories. It's a Berlin industry directory from 1942. If you're asking, what's the use of a Berlin industry directory? It was used to find the addresses of factories that produced ball bearings. And if you're asking, why do they need the addresses of factories that produced ball bearings, and I have some World War II, like ball bearings right here, legit, the real stuff. Ball bearings were used to manufacture fighter planes and tanks and gun carriages and all the moving parts of Hitler's war machine. If you bomb a factory that makes fighter planes, you've only disabled a factory that makes fighter planes. But if you bomb a factory that makes ball bearings, you've disabled all of the factories that use ball bearings to make other things, including the factory that makes fighter planes. Those are some ball bearings from the war. I'm not kidding when I say that a whole subplot of World War II consisted of trying to get control of ball bearings. Khyber was a rare and extraordinary talent. She was the most productive document acquisitions agent of the war. And when you ask, how did she get so good at this? I'd like you to consider that libraries are not only places to reveal information, not only places to store information, they are also places to hide information. For example, in the 18th century, a historian named Edmund Malone was writing a biography of Shakespeare, and he had this notion of literary authorship like we do, where authors are solitary geniuses. So he writes this whole biography, and he brings in some more modern notions of authorship and how Shakespeare worked that were really active in Shakespeare's time. And then he finds in a library an actual diary by a guy named Philip Henslowe, an Elizabethan playwright, that has a lot of information about playwriting in Shakespeare's time that goes against what he put in his book. It was too late to change the biography. The book was about to come out, so he didn't pull the book and change it. He also didn't return the diary to the library. It was returned after his death. I can give other examples. There's a university in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where the faculty of the English department take turns going into the library and reshelving a novel that contains gossip about the English department so that nobody can find it. Or again, at the National Archives, the catalog for the OSS records was made with the help of OSS veterans. This was a good service to history, but they often cataloged the names of men and not the names of women, which means that women's papers are in the archive, but their names aren't findable in the catalog. Or again, for decades, women who have gone to do research at the Vatican archives, where you speak to church officials who decide your access to the books, have advised each other that you get better treatment if you take off your wedding ring. In short, The work of getting archives to reveal their secrets requires a far more complicated set of moves than simply going to the shelf or looking at the catalog. It can require the work of a real bibliographic detective. Adele Kuyber understood this. She went to the Vatican archives herself in her pre-war life as a freelance archive hunter. In 1940, when she asked to see an especially rare manuscript in the Vatican archives, an attendant was horrified, in the words of a contemporary account. He explained that only a certain cardinal could grant such permission. Miss Kuyber immediately asked to see the cardinal. This horrified the attendant even more. Unfazed, Kuyber, the daughter of movie set designers, sent a tempting card of introduction up to His Eminence. Miss Adele Kuyber, Hollywood, California. A minute later, the attendant came down, looking abashed. The cardinal had sent for her, saying, "So, you are from Hollywood. Come, let's talk." She amused the cardinal with an hour and a half of gossip about studio intrigue, and then she got the blessing that she needed to see the manuscript. We'll move now to Joseph Curtis, but the last thing I want to mention about Kuyber is that she was working a lot of different people and crafting a different persona for each. She went around to the library for Sweden's Royal Institute of Technology, the Karolinska Institute Bibliotek, the oldest medical library in Stockholm, which held all manner of medical journals, as well as a marvelous archive of rare books, the library for the Royal Veterinary College of Sweden, which had the medical books that the Karolinska Institute didn't, a civil statistics office, and all kinds of local libraries, because you never know when a book will wash up on the hidden shore of some neighborhood library nobody bothered to check. She made friends with librarians, which is evident from the huge numbers of books that she started to send back in microfilm to the OSS with the notation confidentially borrowed. She made friends with rare book dealers, and she convinced the ones who were on the side of the Germans that she was on the side of the Germans too. She made contacts in the Norwegian underground. She was rumored to have slipped into occupied France on a fishing boat. A real example of how little daylight there is between a good library rat and a good spy. Okay, Joseph Curtis. He taught literature at Yale. He was very much a hothouse flower. He was born and died in the same house, which people only do if they're very poor or very rich. He was very rich. He went to Yale for undergrad, then for grad school, then became a professor there. He lived on campus, had a very genteel, very cozy, very safe little life of letters. And then he was pulled out of that life, trained as a spy, and thrown into wartime Istanbul. Turkey, like Sweden, was neutral territory, though each country sustained neutrality in the war by following opposite policies on espionage. The Swedish government asked the warring countries how Sweden could stay out of the war, and the reply was that Sweden could remain neutral if it let nobody's spies operate in its territory. The Turkish government asked the warring countries how Turkey could stay out of the war, and the reply was that Turkey could remain neutral if it let everybody's spies operate in its territory. Turkey agreed. And so, although spies were running around in both countries, the spies in Stockholm had to work totally underground, whereas Istanbul was a world where everyone was presumed to be a spy. 17 different spy agencies operated openly in Istanbul. Their agents often sat at adjoining restaurant tables trying to eavesdrop on each other's conversations while the waiter eavesdropped on them both. In a world like that, your cover is more important, not less. Curtis's cover was that he was a Yale professor who had been sent to Istanbul to collect books for Yale's library. He went around to the city's bookshops, taught a few classes at the local university. This is a picture of Istanbul's old book bazaar, which is just off the Grand Bazaar. It is a very beautiful place. His actual job was to hunt down German spies and turn them into double agents. The story of how he fell into this job has a lot of twists and turns. He was supposed to have a job like Kuyber's, document hunting, but the Istanbul outpost of the OSS imploded just before he got there because the outpost director thought he was James Bond and was sleeping with his sources, and his sources were enemy agents. The guy's cover was broken so thoroughly that every time he went into one of the city's nightclubs, the band would start playing a song called Boo Boo Baby, I'm a Spy. It was an unmitigated disaster, and the guy didn't even see why it was an unmitigated disaster. Curtis was supposed to set up his cover and wait for somebody in the Istanbul outpost to contact him, but nobody did. After a while, he got tired of waiting and found the outpost director by himself. By that point, the OSS brass had discovered just how badly the outpost was leaking and was hauling most of the agents involved home to the States by the scruff of their necks. The director, Lanning McFarland, was holding on to his own position by his fingernails. Anyway, McFarland, perhaps recognizing that he was dealing with a motivated detective, or perhaps deciding to cover his embarrassment at being found by dumping on the finder a huge task that was sure to embarrass him, or perhaps just understaffed and desperate, responded to Curtis's sudden appearance by giving him surprising new orders. Curtis was told to build a local chapter of the X2 counter-espionage section of the OSS to replace the group of agents who were just fired. How? Just do it, you'll figure it out. X2 stands for double cross. It's a very important branch of spycraft. You want, as far as possible, not to destroy the enemy's spy networks, but to keep them in place and turn them so they work for you. And Curtis, totally unexpectedly, turned out to be very good at this. There's a lot of intrigue and backstabbing in academia, but this was something else altogether. His greatest moment came during the lead up to the Normandy invasion. At that time, the Allies were engaged in what you could call a ghost war. They were using every trick possible to confuse the Nazis as to where and when the invasion would be. Hollywood got involved, building whole decoy battalions and sending actors out to pretend to be soldiers and generals. From London to Marseille to Istanbul to Stockholm, spies burned their covers, worked up dazzling distractions, told more extravagant lies than they'd ever dared, sent false information through double agents. The latter was Joseph Curtis's job. But Curtis's unit didn't just turn enemy agents into double agents. It also convinced many of them to become outright defectors. The defections were the real masterstroke of Istanbul's X2 agents. So many German Abwehr agents in Istanbul defected that Hitler, enraged, fired the head of the Abwehr, Wilhelm Canaris, who until now had been Hitler's chief of intelligence, and dissolved the Abwehr altogether, moving its agents into a police intelligence organization that had a totally different way of doing things. It was a drastic move at the worst possible time for the Germans. Right when the Allies were preparing for what everyone agreed might well be the decisive battle of the war, Hitler started making major changes to his intelligence system, destabilizing the Nazis' flow of intelligence. After the war, history would sing the praises of the double-cross system for its successes in maneuvering the Germans to play the game as the Allies wanted. But the double-cross unit in Istanbul managed to achieve something truly remarkable. It convinced Hitler to remove some of his own pieces from the board. I want to say a few words quickly about Sherman Kent, who was a history professor and a friend of Joseph Curtis at Yale, who rose to become the head of intelligence analysis for all of Europe and Africa. Handsome devil, as you can see from these pictures. Intelligence analysis represented something new in the world of spycraft. The research and development branch of the OSS, which employed researchers in the applied sciences, chemistry, engineering, fields that prepared one to build weapons and spy gear, was a long-established type of institution in other countries. But Kent's branch, research and analysis, which pulled researchers from university departments in the humanities and social sciences, had no equivalent in other spy agencies. These were the people who were working in the New York Public Library, in the basement of the Library of Congress, in temporary plywood buildings all over Washington. The historians, philologists, psychologists, economists, and other humanists of R&A permanently changed the world of spycraft. They proved that, in Sherman Kent's words, well-trained scholars could find out 90% of what an intelligence agency needs to know, without even looking at secret sources. You just have to know how to do the reading. Sherman Kent was actually the perfect man for his job because his job entailed, in part, trying to convince the military to listen to what these Tweedy professors were saying. And Kent, although he was himself a tweed-wearing professor, really should have been a drill sergeant. He was brilliant, but he was always looking for a fight. When he was teaching, he would throw chalk past the heads of his students, which they don't let us do anymore. And after he went to a spy training camp and learned to throw daggers, he was famous for the rest of his career for being able to, quote, throw a knife better than a Sicilian. He was also a man of superb and outrageous profanity, and he could talk to generals in their own language. All the work of the professors and librarians would have been nothing if he hadn't been their spokesman. After the war, Kent left academia and became the head of intelligence analysis for a new agency called the CIA. He wanted to prove to his colleagues that, as I said, well-trained scholars can find out 90% of what an intelligence agency needs to know. So he asked a group of Yale historians to spend the summer in Yale's library reading through publicly available documents and working out, using those documents alone, a series of closely guarded military secrets. He also asked them to write up sort of an encyclopedia giving the answers to holding these secrets. And they succeeded at the task. The report that they produced, they formatted the report as though they were actually sending it to Russia because they thought it would be cute. You can begin to see where this goes wrong, right? The report they produced got leaked to Congress, which panicked because they thought Yale professors were finding out military secrets for the Russians, and everybody got in a lot of trouble. An official from the CIA presented himself at the Yale Library and attempted to confiscate the library's entire contents. The librarians managed to persuade him to take only the papers of the historians involved. It was a very silly episode, but Kent did prove he was right. Okay, so World War II changed the world in a lot of ways. It also changed the world of books. If you pick up a book that was published during World War II, the first thing you're likely to notice is that it feels very light, like a hollow prop, not as heavy as you'd expect a book of its size to be. The war created a paper shortage that forced American publishers to change the paper they were using to much thinner, lighter stock. The situation was far worse in Europe. Public debates arose in Britain about whether the government should start ransacking the nation's archives for paper. I'm passing around one of those books right now. You'll notice how light it is. And you can see right at the front a little announcement explaining why. Government wartime restrictions on materials have made it essential that the amount of paper used in each book be reduced to a minimum, et cetera, et cetera. Here is another book, also printed on very light stock. This is a book of magic tricks, sent out as soldiers' editions. Okay, and this one is the same kind of edition, but a different book, The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. You might have heard of this one. The books in this series were selected by the Council of Books in Wartime and distributed to the troops. Now, The Great Gatsby wouldn't be The Great Gatsby if not for World War II. Fitzgerald, at the time, was in what kids would call his flop era. In 1940, the total sales for all of Fitzgerald's books was a whopping 72 copies. The total scholarly articles about his books could be counted on the fingers of two hands. The Armed Services editions got 155,000 copies of Gatsby into the hands of readers. But more importantly, the Armed Services editions proved to publishers that the paperback format works. After the war, Gatsby was reissued in all kinds of paperback imprints, and readers realized what a classic it was. Without paperbacks, there is no Gatsby. It's just not in the canon. The fate of literature is inextricable from the fate of books. That's not in the spy book. I just thought it was cool. Here is something that's in the spy book. This is the last, and in some ways, the most successful intelligence operation of the war. In early 1945, when a small and very secretive group of people knew the atom bomb would be ready to drop before the year was out, Vannevar Bush, the head of an agency in charge of coordinating war research at US universities, summoned a Princeton professor named Henry DeWolf Smythe to a meeting in Washington. Bush asked Smythe, whose specialty was physics and who served as an advisor for the Manhattan Project, to write an account of the atom bomb, how it was built, how it worked, that could be given to the general public. That is that account. It's titled A General Account of the Development of Methods of Using Atomic Energy for Military Purposes under the Auspices of the United States Government, 1940 to 1945, and it was ready to go when atom bombs destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945. It was an immediate bestseller. Just for your amusement, this is the other book that was at the top of the bestseller lists in the fall of 1945. I believe you will be able to tell without even opening it what it was that made it so appealing to the reading public. The reason the government asked Smythe to write his book was this. They knew that once the atom bomb was known to the world, the public would clamor for the story behind the weapon, and someone, a reporter or a scientist who hadn't signed secrecy documents, would provide it unless the government told the story first. Smythe's book controlled the narrative. It was written to shape people's ideas of the atom bomb in such a way that other countries would find it harder to build one. Now, specifically, what it did was it told a story about physicists, and almost solely about physicists. It told the Oppenheimer story that you've seen in the movies. The government knew that the physics of building an atom bomb was the easiest part to figure out from basic principles, and also, from a certain perspective, the least important part. Far more important, at least for solving the problem of building the bomb, making it explode, all right, were the heroic labors of chemists, engineers, metallurgists, and technicians in Chicago and Los Alamos, who then had their contributions swept from history. Today, the popular term for World War II is the physicists' war, which just goes to show what a triumph this operation was. It was a misinformation coup so successful that it still utterly dominates the way that we think about the atom bomb today. After the war, physics departments found themselves the beneficiaries of soaring enrollments, a flood tide of government funding, and the kind of attention normally afforded to Hollywood stars. After all, everyone knew that the war was, at bottom, a triumph of physicists. What I want to remind you, though, and this is my last lesson of spycraft, is that in matters worthy of great intelligence security, what everyone knows merits a little healthy skepticism. Like I told you earlier, secrets aren't secure. A better way to protect an asset than to just keep it secret is to spread misinformation. So what I've been arguing to you is that this wasn't just the physicists' war. It was also the historians' war, the book collectors' war, the artists' war. It was the professors' war. The war was fought on battlefields, but it was won in libraries. The librarians and professors that I've been talking about and the intelligence analysis that emerged as the product of their work represented something new in the world of intelligence. The United States invented intelligence analysis during World War II because it didn't have a standing intelligence agency and had to turn its disadvantage into an advantage by inventing something new. So it invented the concept of those men and women, book boffins, who were grabbed right out of libraries and universities, sitting in the basement of the Library of Congress and working on problems that, at first glance, might seem laughably trivial. What's the best number of pellets to put in an anti-aircraft shell? What parts of a plane are worth reinforcing with extra armor? What percentage of rubber in German tank tires is synthetic? But here's the thing. The answers to those questions changed the course of the war. These men and women showed that working on supposedly small problems can yield big results. The thing about world-changing discoveries is they don't always come in world-shaking forms. So in the book, you learn about how they did their sideways thinking and how they pulled their intelligence out of incredibly unlikely sources in the library. Intelligence analysis became the foundation of modern spycraft. So spectacular were their contributions that they changed the future of intelligence. And the United States recognized this. Before the war, US libraries were in their flop era, underfunded, very thin collections in comparison to what was available in Europe, because the assumption had always been that if you needed something, you could just go to Europe, which of course turned out not to be the case in wartime. After the war, both university libraries and public libraries were invested in heavily by the US government, which was determined to never be caught so badly lacking again. The US had learned the value of libraries, not just as centers of community and education, but as something that's integral to national security. Unfortunately, 8 decades later, this is the 80th anniversary of our victory in World War II, we have forgotten that lesson. The question you tend to be asked after you write a book like this is, how did ordinary people find the courage to fight against this huge fascist regime? What I've learned and what I believe is that only ordinary people can fight this kind of fight. Or to be more tactical about it, the kinds of people whom Hitler would dismiss or overlook, like women or Jewish people or refugees or factory workers or professors, he didn't think much of professors, were exactly well positioned to run sabotage campaigns or get information from people. Most informants don't know their informants. Or steal from libraries in Europe scientific books and journals, the latest research on atomic physics that they could send to the library at a little place in New Mexico called Los Alamos. These ordinary people, precisely by being ordinary people with a lot of courage, helped to give the Allies their greatest victories. During the D-Day invasion, German reinforcements could very easily have traveled to the Normandy coast and just wiped out the Allied soldiers in what was already a very difficult battle for the Allies to win. The reason the reinforcements didn't come is that a few hours before D-Day, ordinary people who belonged to the French resistance heard a code phrase over the radio and then went outside and destroyed more than 900 sections of railroad. So the trains didn't get to the Normandy coast. This huge battle depended on these ordinary people. Which brings me to my last point. One of the things I've learned while writing this book is that what you have is what you bring to the war. When your back is against the wall, you fall back on your training. The English had spy training schools that were incredibly posh. They were in these country manners and had housemasters and servants and such, because they were English. That's what they knew, so that's what they fell back on. The Americans had these camps with tents where they were teaching people how to do quick draws like cowboys because they were Americans. Of course, they trained like cowboys. The Norwegians were out there on skis. The French resistance robbed liquor stores, drank the wine, and then turned the bottles into Molotov cocktails. Because they're French, they fought as the French do. The librarians also fell back on their training, and it turned out to be, unexpectedly, exactly what modern intelligence needed. But more than this, the reserves of courage that ordinary people found to fight a war against the Reich came from the love and values and struggles that they had before the war. Many of them were doing things like helping refugees before their country got into the war, or they were protesting Hitler's burning of books. The values they learned in peacetime in places like libraries gave them courage during the war. Which is one of the reasons I'm so excited to be bringing out a book that argues that protecting our libraries is a national security issue. What you have is, thank you. It's my big applause line. What you have is what you bring to the war. What we have in libraries is precious and irreplaceable. Thank you. I think I have time to answer a few questions.
There was some article or report I read that when the Soviet Union collapsed, the spies in the United States, and it was undercover, that they were going to the libraries and said that
That sounds about right. I mean, rumor has it that to this day, the CIA does recruiting at the annual American Library Association conference. I don't know whether that's true, but I went to the conference this year and the CIA came up and said, "Hi, we're the CIA." So do with that information what you will. Yes.
How did you get started on this subject?
I've been writing about the history of universities for a long time, and I became curious about why students who were recruited to the CIA in the 1950s and 60s were coming from departments of literature and history. It turns out that literally all of their professors were spies in World War II, and they maintained those agency ties. And after that, the story just got weirder the further that I got into it.
Do you have thoughts about where to go?
Yeah, the National Archives is a place that I would go, and there are freelance researchers, much like Adele Kuyber, who work at the National Archives. You can look up their names on the website, or if you email me, I can give you the name of someone who's very good. And they will do that research for you. They do charge money, but they do excellent work.
Okay, thank you.
Yes?
Were they told not to tell what they did for several, were they never allowed to tell, or could they eventually tell after a number of years what they had done?
It partly depends what country they were working for. So if they were working for Britain or the Commonwealth, there was something called the Official Secrets Act that kept things very mum for a very long time. In the United States, things were a little bit looser, and there was a whole genre of books that was sort of called Now It Can Be Told that came out after the war. On the other hand, people who are really good spies, like, don't want to tell you things, you know? Like the best spies, you just never find out anything from them. It's incredible. Yes?
The lessons that you learned from this work that you think we need to take into account?
Well, the book does tell you how to kill someone with a newspaper. So that's just practical information that I think anybody can use. But I think, really the value of the humanities, the value of, I mean, this is really important stuff for national security. And there are, I mean, gosh, I don't want to get political, but a lot of things are being defunded right now. That I think that it's a genuine national security risk for some of these things to be losing money in the way that, yeah. And I'll leave that there.
Have you considered presenting this material as an academic text, and then you decided to write it for a popular audience?
I wrote my other books as academic texts, although two of them are what's called crossover books. This book, I wrote a proposal and sent it to publishers, so it was intended from the beginning to be a market-facing book. It turns out that writing a book proposal for a publisher, a market-facing publisher. I'm trying to put this in I'm trying not to use academic jargon right now. It's like writing a business proposal. Like you have to very sedulously explain why you will make them money. And that was a new kind of experience for me. The proposal wound up being 92 pages long. It took me longer to write than some other books have taken me to write. So, but it's been a lot of fun from beginning to end.
Kind of a personal question. Have you met a spy personally?
My grandmother worked in intelligence during World War II.
How difficult was it for you to obtain the information you needed?
As I mentioned, some of the information that I used in this book, the information was in the archives, but the people's names weren't in the finding aids because, for example, they were women, and at the time the finding aids were made, people forgot women are people, right? Easy mistake, but it makes it a little bit harder to sort of go in and find that information. And also, it really, really helps to have no capacity for boredom. Right? Like, I know there's someone in the audience who heard, like, ball bearings were important during World War II, and they were like, this is going to be my personality for the next 6 months. And to that person, I say, you would make a great academic or spy. Yes?
Double agents, were the Axis powers sending people here?
They were doing their best to. it was a little bit more difficult. I mean, one thing that the Allies had to their advantage was that the Axis was sort of rejecting, trying to kill, expelling, etc. So many categories of people, right? Not just people who disagreed with the regime, but also Jewish people, and it fired the entire civil service if they didn't support the Nazis and so on. And a lot of those guys went to the United States, then turned right around and became spies for the Allies. And they could speak French, they could speak German, they knew, they could fit in because they were from those countries. There was a marvelous group of people who were called the Ritchie Boys because they trained at Camp Ritchie. And this was a group of largely Jewish refugees who came to the United States, turned right around, trained at Camp Ritchie, and they became, they were intelligence agents. They moved with the front lines, and they got tactical information by interrogating civilians and prisoners of war at the front lines. They provided something like 90% of the actionable tactical, like sort of in the moment military intelligence that the Allies used during the war. And what I'm trying to say is that if you violently exclude entire groups of people, right, that is also a catastrophic intelligence error, that served the Nazis very poorly. Yes, in the back.
Hard to measure, but I imagine there were professors and librarians who said, no, thank you.
I guess so, but they didn't wind up in the history books, so I don't have too much to say about them. Guys, thank you so much. You've been a wonderful audience tonight.